I'm Kevin Libuit, joined by Andrew Page. We are from Theogen, and this is the Bioinformatics Lab podcast. And today we're going to continue on the conversation of the impacts of COG-UK. And there's a specific paper we're going to be highlighting here in terms of the kind of insights genomics data allowed for during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, so cast your mind back to the year or summer of 2020, all was good. We had the initial surge of COVID, and then certainly in Europe, it died down over the summer. And, because there were severe lockdowns, no one could go anywhere. Everyone was like, yeah, grand, things are under control, cases are have subsided. Maybe everything will be okay. And then, of course, things get worse then after that. But what I want to tell you about is a paper by a colleague, Dinesh Aggarwal, who was doing a PhD in the University of Cambridge with the Sanger Institute. He's a medical doctor in infectious diseases, and he recently won an award from the Royal College of Pathologists, a silver medal actually, in the infectious diseases and microbiology category for his paper on genomic assessment of quarantine measures to prevent SARS-CoV-2 importation and transmission. And I was in the lucky position, and my wife, to help out with this paper. We were put together by Sharon Peacock, a collaborator who understood that he needed a bit of genomic support or bioinformatics support to help analyze his data. And so it was kind of nice. What he did was he got all the positive tests that have been sequenced, all the coming into the UK, so returning travelers and travelers. And as they came into the UK, if they tested positive, those samples would be sequenced. And then he had because he had a joint position with the public health body, which at the time was called Public Health England, and is now called UK Health Security Agency. He's able to get the medical information, and he's a medic as well, so he could go to the medical notes and put together this kind of picture. And it's super cool what he found, actually. You could see the kind of leading edge of new lineages coming into the UK. You can see a little upsurge, in the importations. And then, a week or two or three later, you could see in the general surveillance that was going on within COG-UK across the country of people who hadn't traveled, you'd see this massive surge. And so it was the importations and then the surge, in the community. And you could see very clearly it was the importations driving this and kind of sparking things up, because cases were very low at that point. And extinct lineages and extinct whatever, in the UK, which weren't being picked up from surveillance, suddenly reappeared, which is like phenomenal. To get that granularity, to see it actually happening is just insane. Like, I haven't seen this anywhere else. And because this information was there and available, it meant it was being fed back immediately to the government through the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies in the UK. And so government policy could change and adapt using real scientific evidence based on genomics, which I guess is probably the first time that's happened, when you consider it.
It's got to be, yeah, because we were talking about even just the last episode of a lot of this still lived in the academic space of refining the technologies, and we were seeing how it could be laid over maybe retrospective outbreaks and things like this. But through COG-UK, you had amazing real-time capabilities. You had the sequencing and bioinformatics to be able to turn around. And then you had somebody in a position where they could map it to clinical or like really critical metadata there to be able to understand. So how is that process? Because that's always so difficult to do, is whenever you get the sequencing data and then you have the metadata, to be able to use the genomic linkage and then see how that relates to the information about, where this patient was and all the like, that you can draw these kinds of narratives. Like, was that just immediately available to someone in this unique position?
It was
an intent of COG-UK bringing in somebody like Dinesh who can look at both sides of the coin here?
That was the intent. Someone who had that particular set of skills, but also could draw on the skills of others. The right people to bring in at the right times, and he had to be very strict, on what is where the people get infected. So it was only two people who traveled within the last 2 days, Yeah. And of course, the incubation time for SARS-CoV-2 is much longer than that. But you have to be very strict with that definition to really narrow it down. But what was really more interesting was he had the demographics of the people and where they'd been to. And I know at the time, as someone who's in the media and whatever, talking about coronavirus, people were emailing me saying quite racist things. They're like blaming immigrants on bringing in, SARS-CoV-2 into the country,
Yeah.
and migrant workers and whatever, and laying the blame at their door. But actually, one thing that this study did show is that it was young white British people who are going on holidays in the middle of a pandemic to sun holiday locations were bringing it back. And then you could see the immediate impact, in the community. So, it was, lads going on drinking holidays, sitting by the beach.
Yeah.
And actually, I remember there were press reports at the time showing, maskless, young people, not to blame young people in general, but it was just, it was of our own doing. It's not there's no immigrants or people like that causing these problems. It was ourselves and our habits, and maybe we shouldn't have gone on holidays during a pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's a position I can certainly stand behind. And that was, we don't have to get too into that, but that was such an ugly side of the COVID-19 response. You saw a lot of the xenophobic, like knee-jerk reactions of things. It must be the others who are bringing this in. But again, through the genomic data, it elucidates what's actually happening. We can look at the explicit genomic relatedness and present this to the public health officials who need to inform action and even convey this to the general wider audience that is understanding, or at least hopefully starting to understand the individual impact someone can have, even if you're young and healthy, on a population during a pandemic. And then there's also, there's some of the major findings too of like what the impact of quarantine is and how that related to one, even being able to observe what was happening. I think, when you're doing genomic epidemiology, it's hard to find the source of the fire when everything's still burning in a blaze, right? But when everything's sort of down, cool and embers, you can kind of see the sources of where different sparks are coming from. And then there was even, I think, just looking through even just the abstract of the article, I think it was, overall, our study demonstrates that a 14-day quarantine period reduces, but not completely eliminates, the onward transmission of imported cases, mainly by dissuading travel to countries with a quarantine requirement.
I guess you can see in Australia, where they had severe quarantines, and they're far from everyone. And the same with New Zealand. They kept a lot of it out, but at certain points stuff came in. Like there's a famous case of someone who was negative when they got on a plane to New Zealand, and then 19 hours or whatever when they landed, they were positive. And you just can't stop it totally. You can suppress it, you can bring in all these measures, but then at a certain point you have to bring in realism, and what personal liberties people have, and if you go too severe, well, you're also causing harm as well. So it's this kind of trade-off. But I think the part of genomics is to, rather than people making up stuff and using it to, I suppose, further their own aims, like maybe white supremacy or whatever, or racism, then at least you can come back with information and say, actually, no, that's not true. This is what the data actually says. And sometimes data does have uncomfortable stuff, but quite often it does not support a lot of these wacky claims. So yeah, genomics is positive in many ways, just for dispelling a lot of myths. So yeah.
Yeah,
well done,
I mean, yeah, and that's the argument for science, right? Because it presents the data in a way that you have to, you're forced to look at what's actually happening. In the absence of this kind of information, you can throw out any idea there, and you can imagine, especially in that state of like early 2020 or even into 2021, where people are not sure what's happening. They want to have some kind of rationale. So again, you're going to default to what's top of mind, and if it's fear, then you can imagine why people are drawing lines between there's an us and there's a them kind of thing. But I think through the pandemic, we realized there is no them. It's an us world. It's cross borders. We travel, we exchange goods, and so what's happening anywhere is going to be happening everywhere. especially with respect to infectious diseases. And when we can't use those heuristics of like legacy thoughts of, drawing lines by race and race and socioeconomic, all these other things that seem in some context maybe the low hanging obvious thing for somebody to point to of the reason bad things are happening in my life, or bad things are happening in my country, where it's like, no, okay, let's actually look at the information in front of us. Can we figure out what's really happening? And in this case, we found out it's the exact opposite of what people were touting as the main rationale behind cases in the country. It wasn't the others, it was actually our own. It was our kids, it was our young people and things like that were out visiting things. So what was, obviously we can look at it in the academic context. Clearly there's accolades being thrown towards this work now, but as this was actively coming out, was there any resistance to this kind of information you were seeing, or was it really taken up and absorbed by UK and was like, okay, this is then how we act and communicate what's happening?
Partially. I mean, there's a lot of stuff at play because it did encourage them not to necessarily put in quarantine measures or to avoid that. But at the same time, then for, I guess, political reasons, whatever, governments have to be seen to be doing something. And so then actually after that, there was red lists, countries who couldn't come to the UK and things like this. So it at least informed, but, politicians don't have to follow the advice that they are given.
But they'd have to be answered to that, like, whatever decision they made, hey, we can say you had this information in front of you.
And then a few months later, there was the UK variant, or the Alpha variant, kicked off, and then that kind of changed the game again. Again, people were panicking and whatever, and more lockdowns and more whatever. But at least, when there's solid scientific information, you can start to make informed decisions rather than just kind of making stuff up or assuming that you know what's going on when it's not.
And when you're rolling the dice with, millions of people, billions really, when we're talking about the impact of COVID-19. So incredible effort, I think, incredible findings. And what of the processes can you speak to too? Like at this point, whenever sequencing data was coming in, was it already obvious to COG-UK of how to perform this analysis on the bioinformatics side? Okay. So it was still even building the ship as you were sailing, if you will. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, this is the type of analysis that you would do retrospectively a year or two later when you collected all these samples and you're not in the middle of a pandemic and everything is going to hell.
This was amidst the fog of war here, like,
Exactly. You're trying to do stuff. You're trying to build a ship build a plane as it's flying. And so fair play to him for getting anything out the door, let alone really useful stuff. And then as sequencing was going on, there was time delays and all that, more data was coming in, so it was like, when do you stop? When do you just publish, and get the stuff out? But there was always this timeliness was required, get it out the door quickly so we can make informed decisions. And then that led within COG-UK to getting quicker and faster data out the door, and that meant more money being invested in getting quicker and faster processes, because prior to that it was a little bit lax. It was more on an academic footing, finding people were doing stuff quick, maybe within a week or two, but actually then it was to shorten that timeline down to as small as possible. And people did rise to the challenge and were changing processes as they went along and scaling up. And there can be issues with how much do you want to do versus how quickly you want to do it, and costs are involved in that. You can do smaller batches, but they cost more and whatnot. But I think generally people did quite well, and over time the time to get data out into public domain was shortened, and all the data was of course going out into the world, and so anyone can analyze this data, which is kind of cool as well.
So that was obviously a big thing at COG-UK, is the data sharing. And as you mentioned before, like it was, I think at one point for a long time, the majority of the SARS-CoV-2 sequence data was coming straight from COG-UK. So in an instance like this, obviously making sure that this could be reproducible, people could see exactly what was happening, the open source workflows and all the like of how to do this kind of analysis also was contributed to the community.
I mean, at one point early in the pandemic, when my lab was, if my lab was a country, we would have been fourth in the list of countries for the amount of data we were producing. which is kind of shocking, to be honest, for a little lab in Norwich, which is just a small part of the UK.
And you know, it called COG-UK, but it also supported so many other countries as well, you know, right? Like it was far much further reaching just in the borders of the UK and the countries that make up
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe that's an entire other episode, I think,
yeah.
you know, talking about that, because there's so many different countries and stories there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, this was a good one. I feel like, yeah, hats off to Dinesh, everybody that was involved in this work, yourself included. And then obviously for that prestigious award that recognizes the impact of this kind of work.
Absolutely.
All right. Anything else you want to say about this before we end today's conversation?
No, I'm fine.
And congrats to Dinesh there.